The dense canopy of the Appalachian forest loomed over Tim, Sarah, and Jake as they trudged through the mud, their boots slipping in the sodden ground. The air was thick with the earthy scent of wet leaves, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at the storm's approach. Their earlier laughter and chatter had faded into tense silence as dark clouds rolled in, signaling a storm. What was supposed to be a serene weekend escape quickly turned into a battle against the element. "Let's set up the tent here," Tim suggested, pointing to a flat area half hidden by overgrown bushes. His face was set with determination, though a flicker of concern was evident in his eyes. "Before the rain gets worse." Sarah glanced at the sky, her expression clouded with apprehension. "Are you sure this is a good spot? It looks like it could get really muddy." "We don't have much time," Jake interjected, his voice already raised to be heard over the growing wind. "We need to get out of this weather." The trio worked quickly, their movements growing increasingly frantic as the first drops of rain began to fall. The tent's poles were set up with hurried, almost frantic motion, and their fingers fumbled with the stakes as the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. The wind howled, bending the trees and whipping the rain into a frenzy. "Tim, tighten that corner," Jake shouted, his face drenched as he struggled to secure one side of the tent. "It's going to blow away if we don't." Within minutes, the tent was barely anchored when the storm hit with full force. Rain hammered down in sheets, the wind howling like a beast unleashed. The noise was deafening, and the world outside seemed to dissolve into a blur of gray. "Let's split up to gather firewood and supplies," Jake proposed, shouting over the roar of the storm. His face was set with determination, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Sarah, you check that way. Tim, you come with me." Tim nodded, casting a worried glance at Sarah as she headed toward the stream. The dense foliage shielded them from the worst of the downpour. The ground was treacherous and slippery, each step a battle against the mud. "Stay safe," Tim called to Sarah as they disappeared into the trees. Tim and Jake struggled through the downpour, their attempts to gather firewood becoming increasingly futile. The rain turned the forest floor into a slippery quagmire. The trees loomed ominously, their branches groaning under the weight of the water, casting eerie shadows that danced in the dim light. "Let's hurry up," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. He stumbled over a hidden root, barely catching himself. The tent's not going to stay dry forever. They found a few branches but were soaked to the bone, their clothes sticking to their skin. The wind howled through the trees, amplifying the eerie sensation that something was lurking just beyond their vision. The rain fell in relentless torrents, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the forest in stark, frightening detail. As they made their way back, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way with a sickening crunch. Jake's eyes widened in shock as a sudden surge of water from a flash flood roared beneath them. He lost his footing and was nearly swept away by the rushing current. "Hold on," Tim yelled, grabbing Jake's arm with a desperate strength. He managed to pull Jake back. The intensity of the water forced them to retreat, their attempts to salvage their precarious footing nearly in vain. Meanwhile, Sarah was at the edge of the stream, struggling to find dry wood. The water was rising rapidly, swirling with a ferocious intensity. Her eyes darted around nervously, and a loud crack made her freeze. A massive tree branch, dislodged by the flood, crashed into the water nearby, sending a wave crashing over her and soaking her to the bone. Back at the tent, the wind howled, and rain pounded the fabric like a relentless drum. Tim and Jake stumbled back, their arms laden with firewood. Their faces were grim, their bodies shaking from cold and exhaustion. As they approached the tent, they noticed Sarah's spot was empty. "Sarah!" Tim shouted, his voice breaking with worry. "Where are you?" Panic set in as they realized Sarah had not returned. Their attempts to call out for her were swallowed by the wind and rain, the storm's fury amplifying their growing fear. "What if she got lost?" Jake's voice was strained. "We need to find her." After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally staggered back to the tent, movements unsteady and her clothes dripping with water. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her shivering form seemed almost ghostly in the dim light of the tent. She said nothing about what had happened, instead collapsing into the tent with an exhausted sigh. "Dara?" Tim asked, his voice trembling. Are you okay? Sarah simply nodded, her eyes staring blankly at the ground. The coldness of her body made Tim and Jake uneasy, a gnawing discomfort settling in their chests. We need to get a fire going, Jake said, trying to focus on something practical. We need to dry off and warm up. Tim and Jake worked to get the fire started, their hands shaking as they fumbled with wet matches and kindling. Fire sputtered and crackled, its weak light barely dispelling the shadows that danced on the tent walls. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sarah's silence was unsettling. Eyes remained distant and glazed over, as if she were trapped in a world of her own. Tim and Jake tried to keep the fire going, but it was a losing battle against the dampness that seemed to seep into everything. A chill ran through the tent, making them shiver despite the feeble warmth of the fire. The wind howled outside, its mournful wail mixing with the eerie creaks of the tent. Strange noises emanated from beyond the thin fabric. Whispers carried on the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig seemed unnaturally loud. "Did you hear that?" Tim asked, his voice tinged with fear. He stared at the tent's walls as if expecting something to burst through. Jake nodded, eyes wide. "It's probably just the storm," he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. "We've been out in this weather too long." But as the hours passed, the sounds grew more distinct. Footsteps trudging through the mud, rustling leaves, and a low, mournful wail that seemed to pierce the night. Sarah's eyes flickered open briefly, her gaze fixated on a spot in the corner of the tent, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Sarah, are you all right?" Jake asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah's gaze remained fixed, and she shook her head slowly, as if struggling to understand something beyond their perception. The next morning, the storm had abated, leaving the forest eerily quiet. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, and the once bustling forest was now a silent, haunting expanse. Tim and Jake decided to search for any trace of Sarah's earlier whereabouts, their hearts heavy with a growing sense of dread. As they ventured towards the stream, the silence was occasionally broken by the distant call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. Jake stumbled upon a sight that made his blood run cold. Sarah's lifeless body, wedged in a crevice by the water's edge, her face contorted in a final expression of terror. What is this?" Jake gasped, mind racing as he stumbled back, face ashen. Tim approached, his face paling as he recognized the unmistakable signs of death. "She's been dead for days," he said, horror-stricken. His voice trembled, and he could barely bring himself to speak the words. We've been with a ghost." Jake's mind raced as he struggled to process the horrifying truth. He could hardly breathe as the reality sank in. They had been living with Sarah's ghost, unaware that she had been dead for days. The realization was almost too much to bear, each second feeling like an eternity of torment. "What do we do now?" Jake's voice was a whisper, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Tim's eyes were distant, his face set with grim resolve. "We need to get out of here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need to leave this place." As Tim and Jake trudged back to the tent, the oppressive weight of their discovery hung heavily in the air. The storm had finally ceased, but a new storm brewed within them, one of dread and fear. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a tightening noose around their throats. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they entered the tent, seeking solace from the chilling truth they had just uncovered. Inside the tent, the temperature seemed to plummet further. The fire, now nothing more than a feeble flicker, did little to dispel the encroaching cold. Shadows danced grotesquely on the tent walls, elongating and twisting with every gust of wind outside. Tim and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, their minds still reeling from the sight of Sarah's lifeless body by the stream. Suddenly, the air grew colder still. The dim light from the fire cast an eerie glow, and a spectral presence began to take shape. Sarah's ghostly figure appeared before them, face pallid and her eyes hollow, like two empty voids staring into their souls. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying, her presence filling the tent with an unearthly chill. "Sarah?" Jake's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Sarah's ghost remained silent but extended a translucent hand, fingers beckoning them. The gesture was unmistakably clear. She wanted them to follow. Fear gnawed at their resolve, but a morbid curiosity compelled them to follow her spectral form. They ventured out into the forest, their every step crunching through the sodden leaves and mud. The once familiar woods seemed alien in the dim light, shadows twisting into menacing shapes as the canopy overhead swayed with an unseen wind. As they followed Sarah's ghostly form deeper into the forest, trees seemed to close in around them. The darkness grew more profound, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the ghostly apparition. Their hearts raced, each crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making them flinch. Sarah led them to a rocky outcrop, a jagged formation of stones partially obscured by overgrowth. The area was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest reduced to an unsettling silence. Tim and Jake exchanged anxious glances, their fear escalating with every step. "Why are we here?" Tim asked, his voice barely audible. "What's happening?" Jake's eyes widened as he noticed something peculiar about the rocks. His breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay within the dark crevice, a sight that made his blood run cold. The bodies of two people were wedged in the narrow gap between the rocks, their forms twisted and contorted. Their faces, though pale and lifeless, bore the unmistakable signs of death. Wide, unseen eyes and expressions frozen in terror. The sight was a ghastly reflection of their own fears, and the realization hit them like a physical blow. "No, this can't be." Jake's voice faltered, his face turning ashen as he recognized the familiar features of their own body. Tim stumbled back, his legs weak as he tried to comprehend the horror before him. "This is us. We're dead?" he gasped, mind struggling to grasp the impossible truth. The weight of the realization bore down on them, crushing force that left them immobilized. The forest seemed to close in further, trees now pressing against them like an inescapable prison. The ghostly figure of Sarah hovered nearby, her gaze filled with an empty sadness, as if she too were trapped in this nightmarish reality. In the midst of their terror, Tim and Jake understood that their entire experience had been an unending nightmare. The accident that had claimed their lives had also bound their souls to this forest, eternally haunted by the twisted reality of their death. As they stared into the faces of their dead selves, the forest around them seemed to become a living entity, dark, suffocating, and unyielding. The once comforting canopy of trees now felt like a shroud, suffocating them in their perpetual state of dread. The ghost of Sarah, now a tragic emblem of their shared fate, hovered as a constant reminder of the inescapable horror they were doomed to endure. In the chilling silence that followed, Tim and Jake came to terms with their fate. The haunting truth was inescapable. They were forever bound to the forest, trapped in an eternal nightmare, their souls forever haunted by the specter of their tragic accident. It started on a rainy night. Jenna, a college student with a passion for photography, came across an old camera at a flea market. The camera was a vintage model with a distinctive brass finish and a peculiar aura. The vendor, an elderly man with a cryptic smile, sold it to her for a bargain price. He whispered, "This camera captures more than just images." Jenna brushed off the remark as eccentricity. She was excited to test the camera and see what kind of pictures it could take. The next day, Jenna decided to take a walk in the nearby park, camera in hand. She snapped pictures of the serene landscape, capturing the vibrant autumn leaves and the soft sunlight filtering through the trees. The photos turned out beautifully. But as she developed the film, Jenna noticed something strange. In the background of several pictures, there were shadowy figures that weren't visible when she took the shots. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light or an error in developing, but the figures seemed too distinct to ignore. She brushed it off as a glitch and decided to take more photos, intrigued by the oddity. Jenna began using the camera obsessively, photographing everything from her daily life to her friends and family. Each roll of film revealed more unsettling images. People with ghostly faces, strange entities lurking in corners, and dark shapes that seemed to shift as she reviewed them. Despite her growing unease, Jenna couldn't stop using the camera. One evening, she took a photo of her roommate Lisa, who was sitting in the living room, reading a book. When Jenna developed the photo, Lisa's face was replaced by a distorted, horror-stricken expression, her eyes wide with terror. Jenna showed the photo to Lisa, who was shocked but dismissed it as a bad photo. As Jenna continued using the camera, the haunting presence in the photos grew more pronounced. The shadows and figures became more defined and malevolent. Jenna started seeing these apparitions in her daily life, out of the corner of her eye or in reflections. Her dreams were plagued with disturbing visions of the figures from her photos. Her friends noticed her growing paranoia and urged her to stop using the camera. But Jenna, now obsessed, refused to listen. Camera became her constant companion, and she began to fear what might happen if she stopped using it. One night, Jenna was alone in her apartment, reviewing the latest set of photos. She found one that was particularly chilling, a photo of her own bedroom. The image was distorted and filled with dark, writhing shadows. Among the shadows, she could make out her own figure, lying in bed, looking exactly like she did at that moment. Terrified, Jenna decided she had to confront whatever was causing this. She took the camera and set up a makeshift studio in her bedroom. She aimed the camera at herself, intending to capture whatever it was that haunted her. She set the timer and posed, trying to appear calm despite her fear. When the flash went off, Jenna felt an icy chill envelop her. The room seemed to warp and twist as if reality itself was being manipulated. She developed the final roll of film with trembling hands. The last photo was a stark and horrifying revelation. It showed Jenna standing in her bedroom, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. Instead, it was a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure with a menacing grin. In the photo, the figure's hand was reaching out from the mirror, grasping towards the camera. Jenna's heart raced as she realized the figure was not just a reflection, but an entity trying to break through. Jenna's phone rang. It was a message from an unknown number. The message contained only one photo, her own bedroom with the camera in the middle, pointing straight at her, and her own terrified face visible in the camera's viewfinder. Below the photo was a chilling caption: "You were always meant to be the final shot." Panic-stricken, Jenna turned around to find the room eerily quiet and still. The camera was now lying on the floor, and the lens was cracked. She picked it up and looked at it for one last time. The camera emitted a low, eerie hum, and a faint whisper echoed through the room. The cycle continues. Desperate, Jenna tried to leave the apartment, but the door wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows from the photos now manifested into tangible, creeping darkness. Jenna realized with a cold shiver that the camera had claimed her, and there was no escape. The next morning, the apartment was found empty. Jenna was gone, leaving only the camera behind. Her friends and family were bewildered by her disappearance and the strange messages and photos left behind. The silent guest. It was a cold November night when Jonathan first noticed something strange. He lived alone in a small rural house at the edge of town, a quiet, isolated place that suited him just fine. The neighbors were distant, the nights were silent, and the woods behind his house were thick and dark. It was a place where one could easily lose themselves. That night, as he prepared for bed, Jonathan heard a knock at the door. This was unusual. No one ever visited him, especially not at that hour. Hesitant but curious, he went to answer it. To his surprise, no one was there. He stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing except the stillness of the night. Shrugging it off as a prank, Jonathan returned inside. But just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something on the porch. A small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with no markings or labels. There was no note, no sign of where it had come from. Against his better judgment, Jonathan picked up the box and brought it inside. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size, and it was sealed tightly. Jonathan set it on the kitchen table and examined it closely. The wood was old, worn smooth by time, and the edges were nailed shut. There was something unsettling about it, something that made Jonathan hesitate before trying to open it. After a moment's deliberation, he decided to pry it open. Using a small knife, he carefully worked at the seams until the lid popped off with a faint creak. Inside was an old, weathered photograph of a man standing in front of what appeared to be Jonathan's house, though it looked much older in the picture. The man had a stern, expressionless face, and his eyes seemed to bore into Jonathan even through the photograph. Beneath the photo was a small, handwritten note. He never left. Jonathan's skin prickled with unease. He didn't recognize the man in the photo, and there was no explanation for the note. It felt like a warning, and whom, and why? The more he stared at the photo, the more uneasy he became. The man's face seemed to change subtly the longer he looked at it, his eyes growing darker, his expression more menacing. Jonathan decided to put the box away and go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept returning to the photograph, and the strange feeling that he wasn't alone. Over the next few days, Jonathan began to notice strange occurrences in the house. Objects were not where he had left them, doors that were closed were found open, and at night he could hear faint footsteps echoing through the hallways. He tried to convince himself that it was his imagination, but the unease grew stronger with each passing day. One night, as he was lying in bed, Jonathan heard a faint creaking sound coming from the hallway outside his room. It was the sound of floorboards bending under weight, as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately. His heart began to pound, and he held his breath, listening intently. Footsteps grew closer, stopping right outside his bedroom door. Jonathan stared at the door, his mind racing. Should he get up and check? Or should he stay hidden, pretending to be asleep? Suddenly, the door handle began to turn, ever so slowly. The door creaked open, just a crack, but enough for Jonathan to see a sliver of the hallway beyond. His breath caught in his throat as he saw a shadow pass by the crack in the door. Someone, or something, was standing just outside. Jonathan was paralyzed with fear. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before the door slowly creaked shut again. The next morning, Jonathan found himself unable to shake the terror of the night before. He decided to confront whatever it was that was haunting him. He searched the house thoroughly, checking every room, every closet, every corner, but there was no sign of anyone else. As he sat down to catch his breath, he noticed the box from the other night sitting on the table. The photo was still inside. Something had changed. The man in the photo was no longer standing outside the house. Instead, he was inside, standing in what looked like Jonathan's living room. His expression was even more menacing, and his eyes seemed to follow Jonathan no matter where he stood. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He realized with horror that the man in the photo was getting closer, moving through the house, room by room. What would happen when the man reached his bedroom? Panicked, Jonathan decided to destroy the photo. He grabbed it and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. But even as the photograph burned, the uneasy feeling didn't leave him. If anything, it grew stronger. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more persistent. The doors in the house creaked open and shut on their own, and Jonathan could hear whispering, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Desperation drove Jonathan to search for answers. He began digging into the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. After days of research, he discovered something chilling. The house had once belonged to a man named Edward Holloway, who had mysteriously vanished one night, leaving no trace behind. Locals believed that Edward had been cursed, his spirit doomed to wander the house for eternity, unable to leave. Jonathan's fear turned to dread as he realized that the man in the photograph was Edward Holloway. The box, the photo, the note, it was all a warning. Edward's spirit was still in the house, and now it was coming for Jonathan. That night, as the wind howled outside and the house groaned under the weight of the storm, Jonathan prepared for the worst. He locked himself in his bedroom, barricading the door and holding a flashlight in his trembling hands. But it wasn't enough. Footsteps came again, heavier and more deliberate. They stopped outside his door, and Jonathan heard the familiar sound of the handle turning. The door rattled as something tried to force its way in. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jonathan's flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. He backed into a corner, his heart pounding in his chest. The door burst open, and the flashlight died. Jonathan was enveloped in darkness, but he could feel a presence in the room with him. old, malevolent, and hungry. When the neighbors found Jonathan's house the next morning, it was silent and still. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the house was untouched, as if no one had been there for years. But Jonathan was gone. No trace of him was ever found, just like Edward Holloway before him. The only clue left behind was the small wooden box, now empty, sitting on the kitchen table. The house eventually sold to another family, unaware of its dark history. And the cycle began again. Late at night, the new occupants would hear soft footsteps in the hall, and sometimes they'd find a small wooden box on the porch, waiting to be opened. Jake Williams, a seasoned long-distance truck driver, adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as his rig roared down the desolate stretch of Route 66. The night was unusually oppressive, the moon obscured by thick clouds, leaving only the faint glow of his truck's headlights to pierce the inky darkness. Fog clung to the road like a living thing, swirling and shifting in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Jake had always found comfort in the solitude of the open road, the endless miles stretching ahead of him, a balm for his weary soul. But tonight was different. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, as if the very road beneath him was alive, watching, waiting. He had heard the stories, of course. Every trucker who'd been on the road long enough had. Strange things happened on Route 66, especially at night. Disappearances, ghostly apparitions, and time slips were just a few of the tales whispered at truck stops and diners across the country. But Jake had never put much stock in them. He was a practical man, grounded in the reality of the road and the demands of his job. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the reach of his headlights. As midnight approached, the road ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the void. Jake rubbed his eyes, trying to banish the wariness creeping into his bones, when he saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the gloom. The man was tall, his face hidden in the shadows of a hood, his clothes tattered and soaked from the relentless rain. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, especially on a night like this. But something compelled him to slow down, to pull over despite the voice in his head screaming at him to keep driving. The hitchhiker slid into the passenger seat without a word, the cab door closing with a heavy thud that echoed in the stillness. Jake stole a glance at the man, but his face remained obscured by the hood, only his eyes visible, cold, dark, and unreadable. An uneasy silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Jake cleared his throat, trying to shake off the tension. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice sounding too loud in the confined space. The hitchhiker turned his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the road ahead. "Nowhere," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused to speaking. Jake frowned. "What's your name?" "Sam," the man answered, his tone flat, emotionless. The conversation faltered, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing mile. Jake tried to make small talk, asking about the weather, the road conditions, anything to break the oppressive quiet. But Sam's responses were cryptic, almost as if he was speaking in riddles. Jake's unease deepened when the truck's radio suddenly crackled to life, blaring static that made his heart race. He reached out to adjust the dial, but the static only grew louder, filling the cab with a cacophony of white noise, set his teeth on edge. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped, leaving the cab in an eerie silence. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Temperature in the cab had dropped noticeably, and Jake shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart nearly stopping when he thought he saw movement in the back seat, a shadowy figure, just out of focus. But when he turned to look, the seat was empty. His unease turned to fear as he realized something was very wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a primal instinct warning him that he was in danger. And it wasn't just the hitchhiker, it was the road itself, the darkness that seemed to close in around them, fog that swirled with malicious intent. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Pieces didn't fit, nothing made sense anymore. And then Sam spoke, his voice low and menacing, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've been down this road before, Jake. You just don't remember." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his mouth dry. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his efforts to keep it steady. Sam turned to face him, and for the first time Jake saw his face, or rather, a lack of it. The hood fell back, revealing a visage that was not human, but something twisted and grotesque, a mask of shadows and darkness that seemed to shift and change with every breath. "I know your secrets, Jake. I know what you've done." Panic surged through Jake as he struggled to keep the truck on the road, his mind reeling. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted. Even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. Because deep down, he could feel it, the truth lurking in the shadows of his mind, a truth he had buried long ago. Now, it was coming back to haunt him. The miles dragged on, roads stretching endlessly before them, an inescapable tunnel of darkness and fog. Jake's knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel, his eyes darting nervously between the road and the figure beside him. Sam had gone silent, his presence an oppressive weight that filled the cab with a suffocating dread. "Why are you doing this?" Jake finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to look out the window, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, as if recounting a memory. "I was a truck driver once, just like you, years ago. I was on this very road, heading west, just trying to get through the night." Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. "What happened?" Sam's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I picked up a hitchhiker, much like you did tonight. He seemed harmless enough at first, but as the night wore on, I realized there was something off about him. He knew things about me, things no one else could possibly know." A chill ran down Jake's spine. The similarities were too close, too exact. What did he know? Sam's gaze shifted to Jake, his eyes dark and hollow. He knew everything. My fears, my regrets, the mistakes I'd made on the road. He showed me things. Visions of the people I'd hurt, the lives I'd ruined. He made me see their faces, hear their voices, feel their pain. Jake's hands trembled on the steering wheel. "You're lying," he muttered, though he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Sam chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "I wish I was, but the truth is, that hitchhiker wasn't just a man. He was something else, something ancient, something that feeds on guilt and fear. He showed me my worst sins, dragged them out of the darkness and made me confront them. And in the end, he drove me mad." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. "What happened to you?" Sam's expression grew dark, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't survive the night. The hitchhiker drove me to the brink until I couldn't take it anymore. I lost control of the truck, crashed it into the trees. They found my body the next morning, but my soul is trapped here, on this road, cursed to wander it for eternity." Jake's breath hitched, fear clawing at his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" Sam leaned closer, his voice a chilling whisper in Jake's ear. "Because you're next, Jake. You've got your own demons, your own sins to answer for. And this road, this cursed stretch of Route 66, it knows what you've done, and it's going to make you pay." Jake's vision blurred with terror, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this nightmare. But the road ahead seemed endless, the darkness unyielding. He knew deep down that there was no escape. The further they drove, the more Jake began to feel as if reality itself was unraveling. Time stretched and warped, the minutes bleeding into hours, hours into an eternity. The road appeared to loop back on itself, the same landmarks passing by repeatedly, as if they were trapped in some endless night. The fog thickened, swallowing the headlights, until it seemed as though they were driving through a void, a world without end. Sam's presence grew unbearable, constant weight on Jake's psyche. His voice, once merely unsettling, now echoed inside Jake's mind, bypassing his ears and burrowing deep into his thoughts. The words were no longer spoken but felt, resonating within his very soul, each syllable a sharp blade slicing through his sanity. "Do you see them, Jake?" Sam's voice whispered, a cruel taunt that sent shivers down Jake's spine. "Do you see the faces of those you've wronged?" Jake's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The road ahead was a blur, his vision swimming with fear and exhaustion. And then he saw them, faces distorted and ghostly, flickering in and out of the fog. They floated past the windows, eyes wide with accusation, mouths open in silent screams. No, this isn't real, Jake muttered, his voice cracking with desperation. The faces continued to appear, each one more haunting than the last. He recognized them. The hitchhikers he had driven past without stopping, the stranded motorists he had ignored, the people he had left behind. Their eyes bore into him, filled with sorrow, anger, and a deep, unrelenting pain. You could have saved them. Sam's voice intoned, a cold judgment that echoed through Jake's mind. But you didn't, and now their souls are trapped here, just like yours will be. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of darkness and fear. He could feel himself losing control, his grip on reality slipping away with each passing second. The truck seemed to move of its own accord, the steering wheel no longer under his command. The road ahead twisted and turned in impossible ways, a labyrinth of despair from which there was no escape. In his mind's eye, Jake saw himself at the wheel of the truck. He was no longer in control. He was a passenger in his own body, helpless as the darkness closed in around him. Faces outside the window pressed closer, their eyes burning with an unholy light, their screams now audible, a cacophony of agony that filled the cab with a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The fog cleared, revealing a stretch of road Jake didn't recognize. It was lined with towering trees that seemed to loom over the truck, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The headlights illuminated a sign ahead, its letters barely visible through the grime and rust. Welcome to Dead Man's Curve. The word sent a chill down Jake's spine, his heart hammering in his chest. Dead Man's Curve was a place every trucker knew about, a notorious stretch of road where countless accidents had occurred. The stories said that the curve had a mind of its own, a malevolent force that lured drivers to their doom. Jake's hands trembled on the wheel as he tried to slow the truck. The brakes wouldn't respond. The steering wheel twisted in his grip, pulling him toward the curve at an alarming speed. Panic surged through him as the truck hurtled forward, the curve looming closer with every heartbeat. Stop it, Jake screamed, his voice filled with terror. But Sam was silent, his expression cold and unyielding, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. And then they hit the curve. The truck careened wildly, tires screeching against the asphalt as it skidded out of control. Jake fought to regain control, his hands slipping on the wheel as the world spun around him. The trees blurred into a dizzying whirl of green and black, the road disappearing beneath the wheels as the truck veered off the pavement. And then there was nothing but darkness. When Jake awoke, he was slumped over the steering wheel, the truck's engine silent, cab shrouded in darkness. His head throbbed with pain, his body aching from the impact. Slowly, he lifted his head, blinking away the haze of confusion. The first thing he noticed was the cold. It was bone-chilling, seeping into his very core, and he realized with a start that the cab was covered in frost. His breath fogged in the air, each exhale a plume of white vapor that hung in the stillness. Panic set in as he tried to move, his limbs sluggish and unresponsive. The seatbelt was tight across his chest, cutting into his flesh, and he struggled to release it. When he finally managed to unbuckle himself, he fell forward, his knees hitting the floor of the cab with a dull thud. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The crash, it all came rushing back in a wave of terror. But as he looked around, he realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. The truck wasn't in a ditch or on the side of the road. It was in a clearing, surrounded by trees that towered above him like silent sentinels. The road was nowhere to be seen, and the sky overhead was a blank, featureless void, devoid of stars or moonlight. Jake stumbled out of the truck, his legs weak and unsteady. The ground beneath him was cold and hard, covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under his boots. He turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in his surroundings. There was no sound, no movement, nothing but the oppressive silence that pressed down on him like a physical weight. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving him stranded in a place that wasn't quite real. "Where am I?" whispered, his voice trembling with fear. A rustle in the trees made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing but the trees, frost, and the darkness. And then he saw it, figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows. It was Sam, his hood pulled low over his face, posture rigid and unmoving. "Welcome to the end of the road, Jake," Sam said, his voice carrying across the clearing with an eerie calm. Jake's breath hitched, his hands trembling as he backed away. This isn't real. It can't be." Sam took a step forward, his presence looming like a specter in the dark. "Oh, it's real, Jake. As real as the sins you've tried to bury." Jake's back hit the side of the truck, his escape route cut off. He could feel the cold metal against his skin, a stark reminder that there was no way out. "Please, I didn't mean to." Sam's expression remained impassive, his eyes dark and empty. "It doesn't matter what you meant, Jake. The road demands payment, and it's time to settle your debt." "We're not the mayor now." The ground beneath Jake's feet trembled, frost cracking and splintering as something rose from the earth. Faces emerged from the frost, the same faces Jake had seen on the road, the hitchhikers, the stranded motorists, the people he had ignored and left behind. Their eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light, their mouths twisted in silent screams of anguish. Jake's knees buckled, his strength failing him as he fell to the ground. "No, please, I'm sorry." But there was no mercy in Sam's eyes, no forgiveness in his voice. "Your fate was sealed the moment you took this road. Now you will join the others, trapped here for eternity." The faces closed in on Jake, their cold hands reaching for him, pulling him down into the frost. The darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he heard was Sam's voice, echoing in his mind like a curse. "Welcome to the road to nowhere." The next morning, a state trooper patrolling Route 66 found Jake's truck abandoned on the side of the road, the cab empty, the engine cold. The fog had lifted, revealing the familiar stretch of highway that had seen countless accidents and strange occurrences over the years. The trooper called for backup, and soon a search was underway, but no trace of Jake Williams was ever found. The truck was towed to a nearby impound lot, where it sat untouched, a silent witness to the night's events. Months passed since Jake Williams' disappearance, and the story of the haunted Route 66 spread like wildfire. Truckers and travelers alike shared tales of the cursed road, each adding their own twist to the legend. Some spoke of eerie whispers heard on their radios, others of ghostly figures seen in their rearview mirrors, but all shared a common thread. Dead Man's Curve was a place to be avoided at all costs. One crisp autumn evening, a young trucker named Tom Langley found himself driving along Route 66. Tom had heard the stories, but he was skeptical, brushing them off as nothing more than campfire tales meant to scare rookies like him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, he cranked up the volume on his radio, determined to keep his mind on anything but the haunting legends. The familiar hum of his truck was comforting, the steady rhythm of the wheels against the pavement, lulling him into a sense of security. But as the night deepened, a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the road ahead. Tom squinted through the windshield, his hands tightening on the wheel as he slowed his speed. "That's odd," he muttered, glancing at the GPS. The screen flickered, the signal weakening, and for a moment, the display showed nothing but static. A crackle of static came through the radio, followed by a voice, a low, distorted whisper that sent a chill down Tom's spine. He reached for the dial, turning it off, but the voice persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Help me!" Tom's heart raced as he stared at the radio in disbelief. The voice was faint, barely audible, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just a malfunction, glitch in the system. But then the voice spoke again, clearer this time, and Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Please, help me." Against his better judgment, Tom grabbed the radio mic and pressed the talk button. "Who is this? Where are you?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the voice responded, filled with fear and despair. "Dead Man's Curve, they're here. They're coming for me." Tom's blood ran cold. He knew he was close to Dead Man's Curve, the infamous stretch of road where Jake Williams had vanished. The stories flooded back to him, the warnings from other truckers echoing in his mind. But before he could react, the fog thickened, wrapping around his truck like a shroud. The headlights barely pierced the dense mist, illuminating only a few feet of the road ahead. Tom's hands trembled on the wheel as he struggled to keep his truck steady, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, find another route. Something kept him moving forward, an unseen force pulling him toward the curve. As he rounded the bend, the fog parted just enough to reveal a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom's heart leaped into his throat as he slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. It was a man, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face pale and gaunt. He looked up at Tom with hollow eyes, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pierce Tom's very soul. "Please, help me," the man whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Tom's breath caught in his chest as he realized who it was. Jake William. The man who had disappeared on this very road, now standing before him, a ghostly figure lost in time. Before Tom could react, the fog thickened once more, and Jake's figure began to fade, his outline blurring into the mist. The radio crackled to life again, Jake's voice coming through in broken, desperate fragments. "They won't let me go. The road. It's alive." Tom's mind raced, torn between the desire to help and the overwhelming terror that gripped him. But as Jake's voice faded into static, replaced by a chilling silence, Tom knew he had no choice. He had to continue. The truck's engine roared to life as he pressed the gas. The road beneath him seemed to shift, pavement twisting and turning in unnatural ways. The trees on either side loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves rustling with unseen whispers. Tom's grip on the wheel tightened as he fought to keep control, but the truck seemed to have a mind of its own, pulling him deeper into the heart of the curve. Panic surged through him as the road twisted again, this time into a sharp turn he couldn't avoid. The truck careened wildly, the tires screeching against the asphalt as it skidded off the road and into the forest. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he fought to regain control. But the trees closed in around him, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck, and he knew he was trapped. The last thing Tom saw before the truck crashed into the trees was Jake's ghostly figure, standing at the edge of the road, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Forgive me," Jake's voice whispered through the radio, just as the world went black. Days later, the wreckage of Tom Langley's truck was discovered deep in the forest, far from Dead Man's Curve. The authorities were baffled, unable to explain how the truck had ended up so far off the road, or why there was no sign of Tom anywhere near the scene. As the investigation dragged on, rumors began to spread among the truckers who frequented Route 66. They spoke in hushed tones of the road that came alive at night, the curve that swallowed drivers whole, and the ghosts of those who had been lost to its dark embrace. But no one dared speak of it openly, for fear of attracting the road's wrath. And so, the legend of Route 66 grew, a shadow that haunted the dreams of those who traveled it. And in the stillness of the night, when the fog rolled in and the wind whispered through the trees, the road waited, hungry for the next soul to wander into its grasp. For the road to nowhere never truly ended. It was always waiting, always watching, ready to claim its due. The campfire crackled softly as the group of 5 friends huddled closer, their faces bathed in the warm glow of the flames. The dense forest around them was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Tim, the group's self-proclaimed storyteller, leaned in, his voice low and eerie as he spun a tale of a haunted forest. "Legend says the trees here can speak," he whispered, "but only to those who are truly lost." The others chuckled nervously, stealing glances at the towering pines that seemed to close in on their little campsite. As the night wore on, the laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy quiet. It was then that Dave, who had been staring into the dark woods, furrowed his brow. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, her tone a mix of curiosity and apprehension. It sounded like someone whispering." The group fell silent, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper floated through the air, carried by the wind. "Dave?" The voice was soft, almost tender, Dave's eyes widened in shock. "That's my name," he stammered, backing away from the edge of the firelight. "Who's out there?" The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and the others began to hear their own names being called in the same chilling tone. Sarah, Tim, Matt, Blair. The voices overlapped, filling the night with a chorus of eerie, disembodied calls. "Stop it," Sarah cried out, covering her ears. "It's just the wind, it has to be." But the whispers persisted, growing frantic, desperate, the last pleas of someone on the verge of death. "Help us. Please. Don't leave us here." Tim's face drained of color. "We need to leave. Now." As they scrambled to pack up, the trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching out as if trying to ensnare them. The whispers became shrieks, the voices merging into a cacophony of terror. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." In their panic, they fled into the woods, abandoning their gear. Forest was a maze of shadows, every tree a potential trap. The whispers followed them, relentless, guiding them deeper into the woods. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, and they tumbled into a dark pit. The whispers grew deafening, now just above them, the trees closing in like a vice. "Welcome home." By dawn, the campsite was deserted, fire long since extinguished. Their belongings were strewn about, untouched. Forest stood silent, save for the soft rustling of the pine trees, which now whispered new names, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into their grasp. Tom and Lisa were seasoned campers, always seeking out the most remote and untouched places to set up their tent. That's how they ended up deep in an ancient forest, miles from the nearest trail. As dusk fell, they built a small fire and sat down to enjoy the quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Perfect spot, don't you think?" Tom said, stretching his legs. Lisa nodded, her eyes scanning the darkening woods. "It's almost too quiet." As the night deepened, the firelight cast long shadows, making the trees around them look like looming giants. That's when Tom noticed it. Faint, flickering light, far off in the distance. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing towards the trees. Lisa squinted. "Yeah, it looks like a lantern. But who else would be out here?" Curiosity piqued. They grabbed their flashlights and set off towards the light. As they walked, the flicker became more pronounced, swinging gently as if someone was carrying it. But no matter how far they walked, it couldn't seem to get any closer. "This doesn't make sense," Tom muttered, checking his compass. "We should have reached it by now." Lisa shivered. "Maybe we should go back. This doesn't feel right." Just as they were about to turn back, the lantern abruptly stopped moving. It hung from a low branch, the light steady but dim, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. "Let's take it with us," Tom suggested, reaching for the handle. "No doubt." Lisa grabbed his arm, her voice edged with fear. "We don't know who it belongs to." Tom shrugged her off. "It's just a lantern, Lisa." The moment he touched it, the light extinguished, plunging them into complete darkness. They froze, their breath shallow, ears straining to hear any sound. Then, from behind them came a low, raspy breath. "Tom?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "Was that you?" Tom shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled with his flashlight, but it refused to turn on. The breathing grew louder, closer, surrounding them on all sides. "Run!" Tom hissed, grabbing Lisa's hand. They sprinted back towards their campsite, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, path they had taken now unrecognizable. The breathing followed them, in sync with their frantic footsteps, but no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape it. Finally, they burst into their campsite, panting and drenched in sweat. Their fire had gone out, and the tent lay in tatters, as if something had ripped it apart. The lantern was there, hanging from a branch directly above their gear, glowing once again. Tom and Lisa stared at it in horror, realizing that whatever they had brought with them had followed them back. "We need to leave," Lisa whispered, backing away. But as they turned to go, they noticed the shadows around them moving, creeping closer. The breathing was right next to their ears now, bold and relentless. "Tom, I can't move." Lisa gasped, feeling an icy grip around her ankles. The shadows swallowed them whole, and the last thing they saw was the lantern's light flickering, dimming until it finally went out, leaving the forest in silent, suffocating darkness. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the ancient forest as Sarah and Mike embarked on a midnight hike. They had always loved the thrill of exploring uncharted paths, but tonight something felt off. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" Sarah asked, glancing back at their camp, was quickly disappearing into the shadows. Mike grinned, unfazed. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? We'll just go a little way in and head back." They walked for what felt like hours, yet the path seemed endless, winding deeper into the forest with no end in sight. The trees towered above them, their branches intertwining to block out the moonlight, creating a suffocating tunnel of darkness. "Mike, this isn't right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We should have reached the clearing by now." Mike paused, looking around in confusion. "I swear we've been here before." Sarah's breath quickened. "We're going in circles. How is that possible?" Panic set in as they realized the path had become a twisted loop, trapping them in a never-ending maze. Forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the trees creaking and groaning as if they were slowly closing in on them. "We need to stay calm," Mike said, though his voice was shaky. "Let's just retrace our steps." But as they tried to backtrack, forest shifted around them, new paths appearing where none had been before, leading them deeper into the woods. "Mike, look." Sarah pointed to a tree with strange glowing symbols carved into its bark. The symbols pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows on their faces. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, reaching out to touch the symbols. "Don't." Sarah grabbed his hand, her eyes wide with fear. "We don't know what it means." As they stood there, the symbols began to move, the carvings shifting and twisting as if alive. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and suddenly, earth gave way, dragging them down into a pitch-black void. They fell for what seemed like an eternity, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. When they finally hit solid ground, they found themselves in a narrow, suffocating tunnel, the walls covered in the same glowing symbols. "This can't be real," Sarah whispered, a voice echoing in the confined space. Mike's breathing was ragged, his eyes darting around in terror. "We need to get out of here." They crawled through the tunnel, their hands scraping against the rough walls. The symbols seemed to mock them, their glow intensifying with each passing moment. Finally, they emerged into a small, circular clearing, surrounded by the same trees they had been trying to escape. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and covered in moss. On it lay an old, weathered book, its pages open and glowing with the same sickly light. "This has to be some kind of nightmare," Mike said, his voice breaking. Sarah approached the book, drawn to it despite her fear. The pages were filled with incomprehensible symbols, yet she felt compelled to read them. As she did, the forest around them began to change. The trees warping and twisting, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground trembled again, and the symbols on the trees glowed brighter, searing into their minds. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" Mike asked, voice hollow. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with despair. "No, we're trapped." As the symbols burned into their vision, the forest closed in, swallowing them whole. Clearing vanished, and with it, any trace of their existence. The next morning, a new path appeared in the forest, leading unsuspecting hikers deeper into its depth. Those who followed it reported hearing faint cries for help that echoed endlessly, luring them further into the maze. But no one ever found the source of the cries, and those who went too far never returned. Jake had always been fascinated by the woods, spending countless weekends exploring every hidden nook and cranny. So when he stumbled upon a massive, gnarled tree deep in the forest, couldn't resist the urge to investigate. The tree was ancient, bark twisted and cracked with age. A large hollow at its base seemed to beckon him, dark and foreboding. Without thinking, Jake crawled inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hollow opened up into a small, cold room carved into the heart of the tree. The air was thick and musty, filled with the scent of decay. Jake's flashlight beam swept over the walls, revealing deep scratch marks etched into the wood, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. In the center of the room lay a dusty old diary, its leather cover cracked and worn. Jake picked it up, his hands trembling as he flipped through the brittle pages. The diary told the story of a man who had become obsessed with the tree, convinced that it held some ancient, dark power. He had spent years searching for it, and when he finally found it, crawled inside, only to discover that the tree was alive, a malevolent force that fed on the souls of those who entered it. The man had tried to escape, but the tree had sealed itself, trapping him inside. As the days passed, he grew weaker, his mind unraveling as the tree whispered to him, filling his head with maddening thoughts. Jake's heart raced as he read the final, desperate entry. "I can hear it. It's coming for me. I can't get out. Please, if anyone finds this, don't let it take you too." Suddenly, the entrance to the hollow slammed shut, the bark closing over it like a mouth, trapping Jake inside. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, clawing at the walls. The wood was solid, unyielding. "Let me out," he screamed, pounding his fists against the walls. "Please, someone help me." The only response was the creaking of the tree as it tightened its grip, walls closing in on him. The air grew thin, suffocating, as the whispers began, soft, insidious, filling his mind with thoughts that weren't his own. "Stay with me," Tree whispered, its voice a cold caress. "I've been so lonely, so hungry." Jake's vision blurred as the air became thinner, his strength fading. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the scratch marks on the wood glowing faintly. His thoughts became muddled, his mind unraveling as the tree's voice filled his head, drowning out all reason. "Please," Jake gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to die here." The tree's grip tightened, the darkness closing in. The last thing Jake saw before he lost consciousness was the diary, lying open on the ground, the final words burning into his mind. "You are mine now." By morning, Tree stood silent and still, its bark smooth and unmarked. There was no sign of Jake, no trace of his frantic struggle. The hollow had vanished, leaving only the faint sound of scratching from within, growing quieter with each passing day. Emily loved the solitude of camping alone, finding peace in the quiet of the woods. She set up her tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, and spent the day exploring the forest, collecting firewood and enjoying the fresh air. As night fell, she settled into her tent, crackling of the campfire lulling her into a sense of security. But just as she was about to drift off to sleep, a sound jolted her awake. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, circling her tent. Her heart pounded as she lay still, listening. Footsteps were slow, methodical, as if someone was walking around her campsite, just beyond the firelight. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then they started again, this time closer, almost brushing against the side of her tent. Fear gripped her as she grabbed her flashlight, unzipping the tent and shining the light into the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that danced in the flickering light. But there was no one there. Emily stepped out of the tent, her flashlight beams sweeping the clearing. The footsteps had stopped, but in the dirt, she could see faint impressions, footprints leading into the trees. She hesitated, every instinct telling her to stay by the fire. Curiosity got the better of her. She followed the footprint, the light from her flashlight barely penetrating the dense darkness of the forest. Footprints led her deeper into the woods, until they abruptly ended at the edge of a steep cliff. Emily stared down at the drop, confusion and fear twisting in her gut. There was no way anyone could have walked here and vanished without a trace. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine. She turned back towards her campsite, only to find it much farther than she had remembered. As she hurried back, the wind picked up, and the trees seemed to whisper her name, their branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching for her. When she finally reached the clearing, her blood ran cold. Her tent was shredded, the fabric hanging in tatters, and her belongings were scattered across the ground. The fire had been extinguished, the ashes cold and dead. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't an animal. Someone had done this. Panic set in as she realized she was completely alone, miles from the nearest trail, with no way to call for help. The footsteps resumed, now just behind her, impossibly close. She spun around, shining her flashlight into the trees. All she saw was darkness. Footsteps circled her, coming closer and closer, until they suddenly stopped, right next to her. "Who's there?" cried out, her voice cracking with fear. Silent. Then a soft, raspy voice whispered in her ear, so close she could feel the cold breath on her neck. "I've been waiting for you." Emily screamed and bolted for the woods, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. Footsteps followed her, matching her pace, never falling behind. No matter how fast she ran, she couldn't shake them. Branches whipped at her face, roots tripped her. She didn't stop. Footsteps were relentless, closing in on her, their rhythm pounding in her ears. Finally, she tripped and fell, her flashlight skittering away. As she scrambled to her feet, she felt a cold hand grip her ankle, pulling her back down. Emily's scream echoed through the woods. There was no one around to hear it. The trees loomed over her, their branches closing in like a cage. The last thing she saw was a shadowy figure, face obscured, leaning over her as the darkness consumed her. By morning, the clearing was empty, the tent and belongings gone. The only sign that Emily had ever been there were the faint, vanishing footprints leading into the woods, disappearing at the edge of a cliff where the trees whispered her name. It was a moonless night when Ethan found himself on the open road, the miles stretching out ahead of him like a black ribbon unraveling into the unknown. He had been driving for hours, trying to outrun the memories that clawed at the edges of his mind. The road was his escape, the hum of the engine, only companion in the dark. The highway was desolate, with only the occasional flash of distant headlights interrupting the darkness. Ethan had no particular destination in mind, just the need to be anywhere but where he had come from. Breakup with Sarah had been messy, leaving him with a heavy heart and an overwhelming desire to disappear, at least for a little while. He had packed his bags, filled his gas tank, and hit the road, leaving behind the life he had known for something, anything, different. The radio played softly, a station that faded in and out of static as he drove further from civilization. He didn't care much for the music, but it kept him company, filling the silence that had grown too loud in his head. He glanced at the dashboard. The clock read 2:47 a.m. The night felt endless, the road a never-ending loop that twisted through the darkness. Then, in the distance, Ethan saw something, a figure standing on the side of the road. As he approached, the shape became clearer. It was a man, thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. Ethan slowed down, unsure at first, but something about the man's forlorn posture tugged at his conscience. He could use the company, and besides, it was dangerous to leave someone stranded on a road like this in the middle of the night. Ethan pulled over, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. The man approached slowly, his face obscured by the shadows. Ethan rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" Ethan called out. The man nodded, stepping into the light cast by the car's interior. He was tall and thin, with sharp features that seemed almost too defined in the dim glow. His clothes were worn, a simple jacket and jeans, and he carried nothing but a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Thanks," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "I've been walking for hours." "No problem," Ethan replied, unlocking the door. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," the man said, sliding into the passenger seat. He didn't offer more, and Ethan didn't press. They drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out before them in a straight line, cutting through the dense forest on either side. The trees loomed tall, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch them from the road. The hitchhiker stared straight ahead, his hands resting in his lap, his face expressionless. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Roads seemed different, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly how. The darkness around them felt thicker, more oppressive, as if it were closing in. He glanced at the man beside him, who hadn't moved or said a word since getting in. "Been out here long?" Ethan asked, trying to break the tension. "Long enough," the man replied, voice flat. Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say next. The air in the car felt heavy, and the road outside seemed to stretch endlessly, with no signs of civilization in sight. He checked the dashboard again. 3:15 a.m. They should have passed a town or at least a gas station by now, but there was nothing, just the unbroken line of asphalt cutting through the dark. "What brings you out here?" the man asked suddenly, his voice startling Ethan. Just needed to get away for a while, Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone light. Clearing my head, I guess. The man nodded but said nothing more. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine, the unease settling deeper in his gut. The road, which had been straight and familiar, now seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. He hadn't noticed when it started, but now it felt as if they were driving through a maze, with no clear direction or end in sight. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the light didn't seem to penetrate the darkness beyond. Trees on either side appeared to close in, their branches arching over the road like a canopy. Casting eerie shadows danced in the periphery of Ethan's vision. He swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Does this road seem strange to you? He asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he was trying to suppress. The man turned to look at him, his eyes dark and unwritable. It's just a road, he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But maybe it's more than that. Ethan frowned, unsure what to make of the comment. The man's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning that Ethan couldn't quite grasp. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, focusing on the road ahead, but it was becoming harder to ignore the growing sense of dread. Time passed in a blur, the road ahead stretching on and on without end. Clock on the dashboard read 4 a.m., but it felt like they had been driving for much longer. The hitchhiker remained silent, his presence a constant weight on Ethan's mind. The road, once familiar and straightforward, now seemed alien, as if they had crossed into another realm. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the realization began to set in. Something was very wrong. He hadn't seen another car for hours, not even a distant pair of headlights. The road had twisted and turned so much that he couldn't tell which direction they were heading anymore. I think we're lost, Ethan said, the voice strained. The hitchhiker didn't respond immediately. He just stared ahead, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he finally spoke. We're not lost. We're right where we need to be. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. What's that supposed to mean? The man turned to him, his dark eyes locking onto Ethan. This road, not like other roads, it has a way of taking people where they're meant to go, whether they want to or not. Ethan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What are you talking about? This is just a highway. Is it? The man interrupted, his voice calm but with an edge that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Think about it. Have you seen any signs? Any landmarks? Anything that tells you where you are? Ethan's mind raced. He tried to remember the last time he had seen a road sign or a mile marker, but nothing came to mind. It was as if they had entered a void, a place where time and distance had no meaning. What is this place? Ethan whispered, fear creeping into his voice. The hitchhiker smiled, cold, eerie smile that sent a jolt of terror through Ethan. This is the endless road, a place where the lost and the desperate find themselves, where time stands still and the road never ends. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. That's insane. I need to get out of here. I need to turn around. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw nothing but darkness. The road behind them had vanished, swallowed by the night. There was no going back. There's no turning around, the man said softly, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. The road only goes one way, and once you're on it, there's no getting off. Ethan's pulse raced, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. He glanced at the man beside him, searching for any sign of reassurance. Found none. The hitchhiker's expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had accepted his fate long ago. As the hours dragged on, Ethan's desperation grew. He tried everything, turning the car around, speeding up, slowing down. But the road remained the same, stretching out endlessly in both directions. The landscape around them became more twisted. Trees gnarled and blackened as if burned by some unseen fire. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy that made Ethan's skin crawl. He had lost track of time. Clock on the dashboard had stopped working, the hands frozen at 4:47 a.m. It felt like they had been driving for days, maybe even weeks, with no end in sight. The hitchhiker remained silent, its presence a constant reminder, the nightmare Ethan couldn't escape. Ethan's mind began to fray. He started seeing things in the shadows, figures lurking just beyond the edge of the headlights, eyes glowing in the darkness. Whispers filled the car, voices that weren't there, speaking in languages Ethan didn't understand. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with fear. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "This can't be real." But it was real. The endless road was real, and it had him in its grip, refusing to let go. The hitchhiker finally broke the silence. "You're almost there," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "Almost where?" Ethan snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Where the hell are we going?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to look at Ethan, his eyes dark and deep, as if they held the secrets of the universe. "The road only takes you where you're meant to go. You'll find out soon enough." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to know where the road was taking him. He just wanted to escape, to wake up from this nightmare and return to the life he had known, no matter how painful it had been. But the road, other plans. Ethan's eyes burned with exhaustion, his mind teetering on the edge of sanity. The road continued to stretch out before him, a never-ending ribbon of darkness that twisted and turned in impossible ways. The trees had vanished, replaced by jagged cliffs and deep, shadowy ravines, seemed to stretch down into the very bowels of the earth. He knew he couldn't keep driving forever. His body was shutting down, his mind unraveling under the weight of the fear and despair that had gripped him since he had picked up the hitchhike. But there was no stopping, no rest, no escape from the road that had claimed him. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a light, faint at first, but growing brighter as they approached. It was the first sign of anything different in what felt like an eternity. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. The hitchhiker sat up straighter, his eyes fixed on the light ahead. "We're here," said, a note of finality in his voice. Ethan's heart raced as they drew closer to the light. It was a small, dilapidated gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. It looked abandoned, but it was the first sign of civilization Ethan had seen in hours, maybe days. He pulled into the gas station, the car coming to a stop in front of the rusted pumps. The hitchhiker turned to him, that eerie smile returning to his lips. "This is where you get off." Ethan stared at him, his mind struggling to process what was happening. What do you mean?" The man opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. "The road brought you here for a reason. It's time for you to find out why." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the man walk toward the gas station. He wanted to drive away, to leave the hitchhiker and the gas station behind, and never look back. But something held him in place. A sense of inevitability, as if this moment had been predestined. The hitchhiker stopped at the entrance to the gas station, turning to look at Ethan one last time. "We all have our roads to travel," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. "This is yours." And with that, he stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness beyond the door. Ethan sat in the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should leave. Staying here could only lead to something terrible. But his body refused to move. He felt a pull, force drawing him toward the gas station, as if the answers he had been seeking were waiting inside. Slowly, he opened the car door and stepped out. The air was cold, biting at his skin as he walked toward the gas station. The neon sign flickered above him, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. He reached the door, hesitating for a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dark, the shelves dusty and empty. The smell of decay hung in the air, and the only sound was the faint hum of a dying fluorescent light overhead. Ethan stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The hitchhiker was nowhere to be seen, but he knew he was close, watching from the shadows. As he walked further into the gas station, he noticed something on the far wall, a large, cracked mirror, its surface covered in dust and grime. He felt drawn to it, as if it held the key to the nightmare he had been living. He approached the mirror, his reflection barely visible in the murky glass. Slowly, he reached out to wipe away the dust, revealing the image beneath. What he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't his reflection staring back at him. It was the hitchhiker. The same dark eyes, the same sharp features, but twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. Ethan stumbled back, his mind reeling. And then the hitchhiker in the mirror spoke. "You've been on this road for a long time, Ethan," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But it's not the road that's endless, it's you." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. This was his fate, trapped on the endless road, driving endlessly, forever searching for something that didn't exist. The hitchhiker was a part of him. The darkness he had tried to escape could never outrun. The mirror cracked, splintering into 1,000 pieces, each reflecting Ethan's terrified face. The gas station around him began to crumble, the walls collapsing in on themselves, the floor splitting open to reveal a void of endless darkness. Ethan tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness consumed him, pulling him down into the abyss. The last thing he heard was the hitchhiker's laughter echoing in his mind. And then there was nothing. Just the endless road, waiting for its next traveler, ready to claim another soul.